Now we're ready to add a new animation to our player. In order to do this, we're going to open up two new windows so that we can set this up. Let's go to the window menu and open up the animator and also the animation panel. I'm going to drag these down here to the game so that we can test out what we're doing in our scene and still look at the animations. Now, in order for this panel to get populated, we're going to need to select a game object that has an animator and a sprite renderer attached to it. Here you'll see that after selecting player, our animator panel now has each of our animation states. The one we've created so far is player run animation. Entry is the point into this animation state machine, and any state is a way for us to transition between one state to another, no matter where we come from. Now, we could drag the animation of the player standing back into the scene, but then we'd have to go and drag its animator into this window, when we can actually do this all in one simple step. Making sure the player is still selected, let's go to the animation panel. Here, you'll see all of the animations attached to the player. In this case, we have our player run animation, and these are all the frames. If we select where we have the player run animation name, you'll see we can create a new clip. This is going to ask us to save the animation. Let's open this up and make sure we put this in our animations folder. Here, we're going to call this player idle animation, and then let's save it into the folder. Now, the sample rate is going to default to 60, but if we go back and look at our other animation, you'll see that the sample rate was 12 when we dragged the frames into the scene. The sample time represents how many frames per second each frame of animation will render. Here, we're going to want our animation to run a little bit slower than our default running animation. So let's change this value to 6. Now, we'll go back into our artwork folder and into our sprite sheets, and we'll take the first two sprites from the sprite sheet. Let's drag them over to the animation timeline. Now you'll see our animation has been set up. If we hit play, we'll be able to preview this inside of the scene. Let's stop the animation. Another thing to note is you'll see that the play buttons up here and the record button here are in red. And this is telling us that we've not saved this animation yet. So let's do that by hitting Command S and saving the animation. Next, if we move back over to the animator, you'll see that we now have a new animation state called player idle animation. We're going to build a transition between each of these states, and we'll use any state to help make that transition happen. Let's rearrange our animations so that player run is on the left and player idle is on the right. And with any state selected, let's right-click on it and create a new transition. Here, we can drag a connection from any state to any of the other states that we have already set up. In this case, our player run animation, and we'll make a transition over to our player idle animation. By taking advantage of the any state, we don't have to worry about building a transition back, because there's no way to connect back to the any state. You could connect the two together directly, but since we're using any state, this will be a lot cleaner. Next, we're going to need a way of telling which animation needs to run. And to do this, we're going to create a parameter. We'll use the plus sign, and we'll create a new Boolean. And we're going to call this running. Now let's select a transition. Here we're going to have to define what actually triggers this transition. Let's scroll all the way to the bottom, and we'll see conditions. If we hit the plus sign, you'll see that running gets populated, and it's set to true. Now this makes sense because whenever we are running, we want to show the running animation. If we select the other transition and add a new condition, we're going to want to make running false. Now there's one thing you're going to notice in this little preview window here, and that's there's a blue line going from the run animation into the idle animation. Now we want this to be instantaneous. So since we have this transition already selected, let's go into the settings and get rid of our transition duration. We'll set this to 0, and now you'll see here in the preview that this run animation will immediately switch into the idle animation. We're also going to want to disable the can transition to self. Since we're taking advantage of the AnyState to route our transitions, we wouldn't want the player idle animation to go back to AnyState and then go back to itself. Next, let's do the same thing for our player run animation. Here, we'll set the transition duration to 0, and we'll remove the ability to transition to itself. At this point, let's save our scene. Before we move on, let's do a quick test. If we run our game, let's pause it quickly, go into the foreground, and disable the spawner so that we don't have objects pushing our player off the screen, we can go into the animator. Now let's run the game, reselect the animator, and if we click the running boolean and turning this true, you'll see that we can now toggle switching between our animations and preview them. In the next video, we'll set up a class that'll change this through code.